There are stories the internet turns into spectacle. And then there are stories that continue long after the cameras leave. The Whitakers did not begin in 2026. They did not begin with donation links. They did not begin with live stream debates. They did not begin with Eric and Patrick. They began decades earlier, in a rural pocket of Appalachia, in a place called Odd. To understand what happened after Eric and Patrick left, we have to separate three things. What is documented? What is claimed? What is assumed? Because when outsiders exit a vulnerable situation, the vacuum fills quickly. And in that vacuum, narratives multiply. First, the timeline. The Whitakers became widely known through the work of photographer Mark Leiter, whose videos introduced millions to a family living in extreme poverty and with visible developmental disabilities. The early footage showed a small house, inconsistent utilities, limited income, and a family dynamic that functioned collectively rather than individually. For years, they lived in relative obscurity. Then attention accelerated, donations increased, visitors arrived, critics emerged, supporters mobilized. Eventually, new figures entered the picture, including Eric and Patrick, who positioned themselves as on-the-ground helpers. They were present physically. They interacted directly. They promised coordination, structure, stability, and then they left. By early 2026, they were no longer present in the Whitakers' daily lives. That is the point where speculation intensified. So what actually changed? First, the household structure. The Whittaker home had already been altered before Eric and Patrick exited. Some members were living separately. Health conditions had shifted. Outside supervision had fluctuated. The idea that the family unit was stable until those two individuals departed is not supported by public footage from prior years. The family had always been fragile. Second, the money. Online discussions frequently reduce the story to one question: who ended up with the funds? Publicly available information confirms that significant donations were raised over time through various platforms. What is not publicly confirmed is a complete, itemized accounting released to viewers in a formal audit format. That absence does not automatically imply wrongdoing. It does not automatically imply transparency either. It means the public record is incomplete. After Eric and Patrick left, financial control reportedly reverted to remaining family members and our designated local contacts. There is no verified public filing demonstrating criminal charges tied directly to donation misuse as of early 2026. Allegations circulate. Documentation is limited. Third, the living conditions. Contrary to some claims online, the Whitakers were not immediately abandoned to worse conditions after Eric and Patrick departed. Reports from local observers indicate that basic utilities remained functional. Food access continued. Disability benefits, which predated online fame, were still in place. The narrative of instant collapse does not align cleanly with available evidence. However, stability is not the same as improvement. The deeper issue was always long-term sustainability. The Whitakers are not a short-term crisis story. They are a generational poverty story. And generational poverty does not resolve because two intermediaries leave. Another claim circulating in 2026 suggests that law enforcement intervention intensified after Eric and Patrick's departure. Here is what can be verified. There were complaints filed by various community members regarding behavior involving specific individuals associated with the household. There were wellness checks. There were disputes. But no publicly confirmed mass removal operation attributable solely to online controversy has been documented in official records. It is important to say this carefully. Internet outrage does not equal legal action. Comment sections do not equal courtrooms. That distinction matters. Now we address the emotional narrative. When Eric and Patrick exited, many viewers framed it as betrayal. Others framed it as relief. Some claimed they had been exploiting the situation. Others argued they had been unfairly targeted. Both reactions existed simultaneously. But the Whitakers themselves, the individuals living in that house, did not release a formal public statement outlining grievances, contracts, or violations. Their communication style has always been limited, and outside representatives often speak on their behalf, which creates a problem. When the subject of a story cannot easily articulate their own account, intermediaries shape perception, and intermediaries often disagree. By mid-2026, coverage of the Whitakers had fractured into three camps. Those who believe exploitation defined the entire arc. Those who believe help was genuine but mismanaged. Those who believe outside involvement, any involvement, destabilized a family that had survived 70 years largely on its own terms. Each camp presents selective evidence. Very few present full documentation. There is another factor rarely discussed: attention fatigue. For years, the Whitakers were central to multiple channels. Once Eric and Patrick left, content volume declined. Fewer updates, fewer on-site videos, fewer donation pushes. When attention declines, so does perceived urgency. But daily life continues. Disability does not disappear. Poverty does not vanish. Community stigma does not dissolve. The question is not simply what happened after two men left. The question is whether the online spotlight, which began years earlier, fundamentally altered the trajectory of a family that had functioned in isolation. There is evidence that it did. Public exposure brought money. It also brought scrutiny. It brought resources. It also brought resentment from some viewers who believed assistance was undeserved. Comment sections increasingly reflected a divide: sympathy versus judgment. Why help them? Why not help others? Why send money when addiction exists? Why intervene at all? Those questions intensified in 2026. Because when visible intermediaries exit, blame requires a new target. Some blamed the remaining family members. Some blamed prior helpers. Some blamed the original exposure itself. Very few examined the systemic factors that predated all of it. Rural economic decline, limited healthcare access, educational resource gaps, generational disability without structured support. Eric and Patrick leaving did not create those conditions. They existed long before cameras. Another verified development in 2026 involved decreased in-person visitation from outside content creators. Public criticism and legal concerns made many hesitant to appear physically at the property. That reduced interference. It also reduced outside monitoring. For some observers, that was positive. For others, concerning. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. When vulnerable adults live in isolated conditions, outside presence can be both protective and intrusive. Remove it entirely, and you remove both dynamics. So what happened after Eric and Patrick left? No dramatic collapse documented. No verified mass fraud conviction publicly confirmed. No televised reunion. No public apology tour. What happened was quieter. Fragmentation. Reduced coordination. Reduced centralized narrative. Reduced visibility. The Whitakers did not vanish. They receded from the algorithm. And in the digital age, receding can look like disappearance. But absence of viral clips is not absence of life. As of early 2026, the family remained in West Virginia. They remained economically limited. They remained dependent on disability income and local support. They remained controversial online. The difference is this: the spotlight is dimmer, the intermediaries are fewer, the arguments are louder than the evidence. Before we move further, we need to ask a harder question. Did outside involvement ultimately help or harm? Because after Eric and Patrick left, that debate stopped being theoretical. It became retrospective. And retrospective analysis requires more than emotion. It requires separating cause from coincidence. When people ask what happened after Eric and Patrick left, they are usually not asking about porch conversations or daily routines. They are asking about money. Because in every public story involving poverty, the central suspicion eventually becomes financial. Who controlled it? Who distributed it? Who benefited? Who didn't? And most importantly, where did it go? Before answering that, we need to establish something clearly. The Whitakers were receiving income long before YouTube exposure. Disability benefits, supplemental assistance, occasional local aid, community support. Online donations were not their first source of survival. They were an additional layer. That distinction matters because it prevents the narrative from collapsing into a single oversimplified claim that once online fundraising slowed, the family was left with nothing. There is no verified public evidence supporting that extreme conclusion. However, there is also no publicly released independent audit detailing the total amount raised across all platforms over the years. That gap is where suspicion grows. Let's break this down carefully. Over several years, significant funds were reportedly raised through crowdfunding platforms, direct donations, merchandise promotions, and had revenue connected to content featuring the Whitakers. Some of those funds were publicly shown being used for home repairs, a replacement house, appliances, clothing, vehicles, medical needs. Some expenditures were visible on camera, others were not. Once Eric and Patrick left, one of the immediate online narratives suggested that money had disappeared. Another narrative claimed that the family had mismanaged funds. A third suggested that outsiders had mishandled distribution before leaving. As of 2026, there has been no confirmed criminal conviction tied directly to donation theft in connection to the Whittaker fundraising efforts. That does not prove perfect management. It does not prove misconduct either. It proves that allegations remain largely in the realm of online dispute. An online dispute is not the same as legal finding. Here is where nuance is important. Crowdfunding for vulnerable families exists in a gray space between charity and informal aid. Unless funds are raised through a registered nonprofit structure with mandated disclosures, detailed accounting is often not legally required in the way institutional charities must report. Many viewers assumed formal nonprofit level transparency. There is no public documentation confirming that such formal structure governed all fundraising phases. So when Eric and Patrick exited, questions intensified. Was there a ledger? Was there oversight? Were funds jointly controlled? Did the family understand the full scope of what had been raised? Those questions have not been answered in a comprehensive public report, and in the absence of clarity, camps hardened. One group argued, if there was wrongdoing, charges would already exist. Another group argued, lack of charges does not equal ethical handling. Both statements can coexist. By mid-2026, discussions about potential civil disputes circulated online. However, no publicly accessible court database showed a finalized judgment directly tied to misappropriation of Whittaker donation funds. Again, that is not confirmation of perfection. It is confirmation of limited verified record. There is another uncomfortable factor rarely acknowledged. When large sums of money suddenly enter a household that has functioned for decades under poverty conditions, adaptation is not automatic. Financial literacy, long-term planning, investment strategy, asset protection. These are learned systems. They are not instinctive. If significant funds were indeed received over time, and publicly visible purchases suggest at least substantial amounts, long-term sustainability would have required structured planning. There is no public documentation confirming that such structured planning was implemented with professional oversight, and when Eric and Patrick left, any informal coordination they may have provided left with them. Another issue frequently discussed in 2026 involves vehicles. Online commenters alleged reckless driving and drug-related behavior connected to specific individuals associated with the household. Some viewers demanded that content creators intervene or report behavior. Here we need to draw a line. Content creators are not law enforcement. Viewers are not courts. Allegations online do not equal conviction. If illegal activity occurred, proper channels exist. But there is no verified public record demonstrating that financial mismanagement automatically led to legal seizure of Whittaker assets after Eric and Patrick departed. What appears more consistent with available information is gradual diffusion. Funds were spent, repairs were made, vehicles were purchased, daily needs were covered. Without formal long-term financial structure, money diminishes. Not because of conspiracy necessarily, because spending continues. Utilities, food, fuel, maintenance, medical costs, transportation, unexpected expenses. When online attention cooled, additional fundraising waves also cooled. And that shift created perception, decline. But perception does not always reflect collapse. Another critical question surfaced repeatedly. Did Eric and Patrick personally profit? Public claims vary widely. Some supporters insist they sacrificed time and resources. Some critics insist they benefited financially. Some argue both are true simultaneously. There is no publicly released forensic audit resolving this dispute conclusively. What we do know is this: they left. They did not maintain ongoing visible management. They did not continue frequent in-person appearances. And when intermediaries exit a charitable dynamic, uncertainty expands. It is also worth addressing jealousy. Comment sections revealed a recurring sentiment. Why should they receive help when others are struggling? That question did not disappear in 2026. In fact, it intensified after the spotlight dimmed, because when people feel that aid was mishandled, resentment often shifts from organizers to recipients. That dynamic is ethically dangerous. The Whitakers did not design the internet machine that amplified them. They did not create the fundraising infrastructure. They did not market themselves as a charity brand. They became visible. Visibility attracted money. Money attracted control questions. Control questions attracted division. After Eric and Patrick left, what remained was a family still in rural West Virginia, still limited by disability, still economically fragile. The difference was this: the coordination layer was gone. And when coordination disappears, informal systems strain. There is no verified documentation showing the family was left entirely destitute. There is also no verified documentation showing a long-term trust fund was established to secure multi-decade stability. The truth likely exists somewhere in between. Short-term improvement, long-term vulnerability. Another piece of the financial aftermath involves content monetization. Videos featuring the Whitakers generated ad revenue for creators. When Eric and Patrick left, some creators reduced coverage. Others shifted focus to commentary rather than direct interaction. Ad revenue flows differently when original access changes, and that shift further complicated public perception about who was benefiting and who was not. In 2026, the financial question remains unresolved not because evidence proves wrongdoing, but because comprehensive documentation has never been fully consolidated into one transparent, public ledger. And without that ledger, people fill gaps with suspicion. It is easier to assume theft than to accept administrative ambiguity. It is easier to assume collapse than to accept gradual depletion. But serious analysis requires restraint. As of this update, no widely publicized conviction. No confirmed federal seizure directly tied to Whittaker fundraising. No official public bankruptcy filing tied specifically to online donations. No verified public audit clearing every question either. What remains is uncertainty laid over a family that was already fragile before money entered the picture. And here is the deeper issue. Financial intervention without structural support can create dependency on intermediaries. When those intermediaries leave, trust fractures. Not necessarily because of crime, sometimes simply because of absence. After Eric and Patrick left, the Whitakers did not issue financial statements. They returned, as much as possible, to limited public visibility, and the internet, which once demanded constant updates, began arguing with itself instead. Money is measurable. Human fallout is not. When Eric and Patrick left, the financial questions dominated the conversation. But underneath the accounting debates was something quieter, and arguably more important. What did the exposure itself do to the Whitakers? Not the donations, not the vehicles, not the repairs. The exposure. For decades, the family lived in relative isolation near Odd. Their world was small. Their routines were predictable. Their social structure was internal. They were known locally, but not nationally. Then millions of people watched them. That shift cannot be reversed. And when Eric and Patrick left, what remained was not just a family with fewer intermediaries. It was a family permanently changed by visibility. Let's begin with something uncomfortable. Public exposure alters power dynamics inside a household. When cameras arrive, some members become focal points. Some become spokespersons. Some become background. Over time, outside attention can elevate certain individuals in ways that reshape internal authority, even unintentionally. Before online fame, family hierarchy likely followed long-established patterns. Age, ability, personality, survival roles. After fame, a new hierarchy emerged. Who speaks on camera? Who interacts with visitors? Who handles donations? Who becomes the recognizable face? When intermediaries like Eric and Patrick were present, they acted as filters. They absorbed pressure from viewers. They translated online commentary into in-person decisions. They sometimes shielded the family from direct digital hostility. Once they left, that buffer diminished. And without a buffer, exposure feels different. Another rarely discussed factor is community tension. When a rural household becomes globally known, local relationships can shift. Some neighbors may feel protective. Some may feel resentful. Some may feel embarrassed by the portrayal of their region. Appalachia has long battled stereotypes: poverty, addiction, inbreeding, isolation. When the Whitakers became a viral representation of that stereotype, it didn't just affect them. It affected how outsiders viewed the broader region. And after Eric and Patrick exited, that perception remained. The cameras may have slowed, but the label did not disappear. There is also the issue of dependency. Not financial dependency, relational dependency. When people visit frequently, bring supplies, coordinate appointments, manage logistics, a rhythm forms. If that rhythm stops abruptly, even if the family can survive materially, adjustment is required. Daily life shifts. Who drives? Who organizes? Who answers calls? Who handles conflicts? There is no verified public record detailing a structured transition plan when Eric and Patrick departed. That absence does not imply abandonment. It does suggest discontinuity. Discontinuity is destabilizing in any environment. It is especially destabilizing in households where several members rely on routine and predictable structure. By mid-2026, reports suggested reduced visitor frequency overall. Some former supporters hesitated to appear publicly due to online backlash. Others distanced themselves to avoid controversy. The Whitakers, in effect, experienced a secondary isolation. Not the original geographic isolation. A reputational isolation. Too controversial for some. Too vulnerable for others. Too complicated for many. That creates a paradox. Fame brought attention. Controversy reduced sustained support. And withdrawal left them more alone than during peak visibility. Another layer to consider is identity. For years, the Whitakers were framed online as America's most inbred family. That label spread widely. It became shorthand. It overshadowed individual identities. When Eric and Patrick left, the debate shifted from how do we help them to who exploited whom. Notice what disappeared from that equation. Them. The individuals themselves became secondary to arguments about ethics. Public discourse often centered on content creators, on transparency, on morality, on blame. But the Whitakers' daily human experience, their emotional reality, was rarely centered. We need to ask a harder question. What does it do to a family with cognitive limitations to become an international curiosity? Long-term psychological impact is difficult to measure, especially when formal mental health assessments are not publicly released. However, basic social principles apply. When strangers repeatedly visit your home, when cameras record your vulnerabilities, when millions discuss your appearance and speech, when your name becomes a meme, something changes. After Eric and Patrick left, that global commentary did not immediately stop, but the direct engagement did decrease. And with decreased engagement comes a strange silence. Imagine going from constant visitors and online messages to fewer check-ins. The adrenaline fades. The routine shifts. The attention quiets. Some people thrive in quieter environments. Others struggle with abrupt change. There is no public psychological evaluation available. There are no published interviews detailing emotional adjustment post-departure. What remains is inference based on observable social dynamics. Another point often ignored is autonomy. Critics frequently argue that the Whitakers were manipulated or directed by intermediaries. Supporters argue that assistance improved living conditions. Both claims can exist simultaneously. But once Eric and Patrick left, the family regained a greater degree of autonomy over their daily environment, whether or not that autonomy was structurally supported. Autonomy without structure can be liberating. It can also be overwhelming, especially when disability is involved. By 2026, fewer coordinated improvement projects were visible publicly. No widely publicized renovation campaigns. No major fundraising pushes. That does not prove deterioration. It suggests stabilization at a lower activity level. And perhaps that was necessary. Because another uncomfortable truth is this. Continuous intervention can create performance pressure. When improvement becomes content, progress must be visible. When visible progress slows, audience interest declines. When audience interest declines, Funding slows. That cycle is unsustainable long-term. Removing intermediaries may have reduced that performance pressure, but it also reduced structured advocacy. Which brings us to law enforcement and oversight. There were online rumors suggesting intensified investigations. There is no confirmed public documentation of a sweeping legal intervention directly caused by Eric and Patrick leaving. There were complaints. There were wellness checks. There were allegations regarding behavior. But allegations do not equal systemic removal. The family remained in West Virginia. They remained together in some configuration. They did not disappear into state custody. That is verifiable through continued local presence. Another factor is aging. Several Whittaker family members are older adults. Aging increases vulnerability regardless of online controversy. Health decline, mobility issues, medical needs. Those realities continue whether cameras are present or not. After Eric and Patrick left, aging did not pause. If anything, reduced outside coordination may have made medical logistics more difficult. But again, there is no public evidence of catastrophic medical abandonment. There is only less documentation. And less documentation feels like absence in the digital era. We should also examine public fatigue. Audiences move on quickly. New controversies replace old ones. New viral stories replace prior spectacles. By 2026, Whittaker coverage no longer dominated online discussion. That does not mean the family ceased to exist. It means the algorithm moved on. And when the algorithm moves on, support networks built primarily through algorithmic attention weaken. So what did exposure ultimately do? It improved housing temporarily. It brought money. It brought scrutiny. It created division. It altered internal power structures. It reshaped local reputation. It generated global judgment. It introduced intermittent structure. It then removed that structure. After Eric and Patrick left, what remained was not a dramatic implosion. It was a recalibration, a return to smaller routines, reduced visibility, fewer intermediaries, lingering suspicion, lingering labels, and perhaps, though this cannot be measured, a deeper exhaustion. Because being watched constantly is exhausting. There is a tendency, when stories end messily, to look for a clean verdict. Helped or harmed, exploited or rescued, heroes or villains. But the Whitakers' story, especially after Eric and Patrick left, does not resolve into a clean verdict. It settles into complexity. Let's begin with the simplest measurable outcome. Housing conditions improved compared to the earliest widely circulated footage connected to Mark Leiter. Structural repairs were made. Basic utilities became more consistent. Material stability increased, at least temporarily. That is not speculation. That is visible. So in strictly physical terms, outside exposure produced tangible upgrades. Now we move to the less measurable outcomes. Reputation. Before national exposure, the Whitakers were locally known in Odd. After viral coverage, they became internationally labeled. The phrase attached to their names spread rapidly. It followed them into comment sections. It followed them into interviews. It followed them long after intermediaries exited. Exposure does not disappear when helpers leave. It embeds. And reputational embedding can outlast material improvements. Then there is relational fracture. When Eric and Patrick left, online communities split into camps. Accusations circulated. Allegiance debates intensified. Some supporters distanced themselves entirely to avoid controversy. The Whitakers did not publicly initiate those fractures, but they lived in the aftermath of them. Which raises a difficult question. When outsiders enter a vulnerable household with good intentions, What responsibility do they carry for long-term consequences once they exit? Not legal responsibility, ethical responsibility. There is no universal standard. Intervention without structure risks instability. Non-intervention risks neglect. Exposure without safeguards risks stigma. Silence risks invisibility. The Whitakers existed at the intersection of all four. Another critical factor is agency. Throughout years of coverage, the family's ability to articulate informed consent has been debated. Developmental disabilities complicate traditional ideas of consent in media exposure. Yet complete removal of agency can also be patronizing. After Eric and Patrick left, the family retained more direct control over who entered their space. That can be viewed as restoration of agency. It can also be viewed as removal of protective oversight. Both interpretations depend on the observer's assumptions. We should also confront something uncomfortable about viewers. Audiences often consume poverty as narrative. Struggle becomes episodic. Improvement becomes a season finale. Conflict becomes a subplot. When Eric and Patrick exited, the story lost its visible coordinators. The narrative arc fractured. For some viewers, that felt like betrayal. But real lives are not structured like serialized content. There is no guaranteed redemption arc. No mandated closure. Only continuation. As of 2026, there is no verified public documentation showing catastrophic institutional collapse directly triggered by the departure of Eric and Patrick. There is also no verified public audit conclusively clearing every financial question. There is no sweeping legal conviction that resolves all accusations. There is no comprehensive transparency report that erases suspicion. What remains is ambiguity. And ambiguity is uncomfortable for the internet, because ambiguity requires restraint. So was outside involvement a net benefit? Materially, yes, at least in observable phases. Was it a net harm? In reputational terms, possibly, depending on how one weighs global stigma against improved living conditions. Was it exploitation? There is no definitive legal ruling declaring it so. Was it imperfect? Almost certainly. What often gets overlooked is that the Whitakers' core challenges, developmental disability, rural poverty, aging caregivers, limited infrastructure, predated cameras, and will likely persist regardless of online interest. Eric and Patrick did not create those structural realities. They entered them. They influenced them. They left them. The deeper issue is systemic. Rural Appalachia has long faced limited healthcare access, educational resource gaps, economic decline, and intergenerational hardship. One household becoming viral does not resolve those conditions. And perhaps that is the hardest conclusion of all. The internet wants a culprit, or a savior. What it rarely accepts is structural complexity. After Eric and Patrick left, the Whitakers did not vanish. They continued living, aging, managing daily needs, navigating local dynamics. The spotlight dimmed, but life did not. And maybe the most honest assessment is this. Outside intervention altered the trajectory temporarily. It introduced resources. It introduced division. It amplified scrutiny. It did not permanently solve systemic vulnerability. When we ask what happened after Eric and Patrick left, we are really asking whether any outsider can sustainably reshape decades of isolation without building formal, durable infrastructure. There is no evidence that such infrastructure was ever fully established. So the story did not end with triumph. It did not end with dramatic ruin. It settled back into the quiet difficulty that existed before fame, only now layered with permanent public memory. There are stories the internet turns into spectacle. And then there are stories that continue long after the spectacle fades. The Whittaker's story is not over. It is simply no longer trending. And that may be the most honest update 2026 can offer. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.